Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. In the deepest memory of the world, before the sun rose golden over the eastern hills, before the moon sailed silver through the night sky, there existed a light more ancient and more pure than any that would follow. In the realm of the Valor, in the blessed lands of Valinor far across the western ocean, two trees stood upon the green mound of Ezilohar. Tulperion, the elder, bore leaves of dark green with undersides of shining silver, and from his innumerable flowers a dew of silver light fell continuously to the ground. Laurelin the younger lifted boughs laden with leaves edged in pale gold, and from her hanging clusters of golden flowers there dripped a rain of light like the honey of the gods themselves. These were the two trees of Valinor, and their mingled radiance illuminated all the blessed realm with a beauty that would never be seen again in the circles of the world. But in the forgotten corners of creation, in the spaces between stars where even the light of the trees could not penetrate, something stirred. A presence, a hunger. A darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but something far more terrible. An active, consuming void that sought to devour illumination itself, to unmake the very essence of radiance and transform it into an emptiness that could never be filled. This presence had no name that the Valor knew, or if it had one, they did not speak it aloud. It moved in shadows, dwelling in the pits and caverns beneath the world, spinning webs of darkness so absolute that even the keenest elven eyes could not pierce them. This was Ungoliant, the great spider, the Gloomweaver. And though thousands of years have passed since she first emerged from the primordial dark, though ages of the world have risen and fallen like waves upon a shore, her shadow still stretches across Middle-earth. Her hunger still echoes in the deepest places, and the full truth of what she was, of where she came from and what darkness gave her birth, remains one of the most terrible and closely guarded secrets in all of Tolkien's legendarium. Picture, if you dare, the moment when she first became aware of the light of the two trees. Imagine that ancient intelligence, dwelling in absolute darkness for time beyond reckoning, suddenly perceiving a radiance so pure and overwhelming that it awakened in her a hunger more profound than any she had known before. For Ungoliant was not a creature of simple appetite, not a beast that fed merely to sustain itself. Her hunger was existential, metaphysical, a fundamental rejection of being itself, a desire not just to consume, but to uncreate, to reduce all existence to the void from which it sprang. The Valor, those mighty angelic powers who had shaped the world under the direction of Iluvatar, the one god, knew fear when they considered her. Manwë, lord of the winds and king of Arda, whose vision could pierce through cloud and darkness across all the circles of the world, found his sight failing when it turned toward the places where she dwelt. Varda, queen of the stars, whose hands had kindled the ancient lights in the heavens, felt a chill in her heart when whispers came of something that could devour even starlight itself. And Yavanna, who had sung the two trees into being, wept in her dreams, sensing some terrible doom approaching the greatest of all her works. Who was Ungoliant? What was she? These questions have haunted Tolkien's scholars for generations, for the great professor left her origins deliberately, maddeningly ambiguous. Was she one of the Maiar, the lesser spirits who served the Valor, who had fallen into corruption so profound that her very nature transformed into something unrecognizable? Was she a manifestation of the void itself, the nothingness that existed before creation, somehow given form and will and terrible purpose? Or was she something else entirely, something that even the Aenir, those holy ones who existed before the world was made, did not fully understand? The texts give us only fragments, tantalizing and terrifying hints. The Silmarillion tells us that she came from the darkness that lies about Arda, that she had descended there before the raising of the trees. Unfinished Tales suggests she may have been of the same order as Sauron and the Balrogs, a corrupted Maya. But even this is speculation, filtered through the uncertain knowledge of elven loremasters writing long after the events they describe. Tolkien's own notes reveal his struggle with her nature, drafts and revisions where he grappled with the question of what she represented. What metaphysical category could contain a being of such absolute negation? What we know with certainty is her hunger. Not the hunger of flesh and blood, not the temporary craving that can be sated with a meal, but an eternal, insatiable void that consumed everything it touched and only grew larger, darker, more desperate with each feeding. She devoured light like a poison, drawing it into herself and transforming it into a darkness more complete than any natural shadow. Where she walked, she left behind her a region of such absolute blackness that the eyes saw nothing. Not even the darkness itself, only an absence, a space where vision ceased to have meaning. And from this hunger, a shadow would creep across all the world, a shadow that would devour the light of the two trees themselves, that would plunge all of Arda into a darkness from which it would never fully emerge. And that would give birth to terrors that would haunt Middle-earth through all the ages that followed, down even to the time when a small hobbit would face one of her monstrous descendants in a dark tunnel, fighting for his life while the fate of the world hung in the balance. But we race ahead of ourselves. To understand the full horror of what Ungoliant became, we must first understand what the world was like before her hunger consumed its greatest light. The music of the Aenir, the great theme that shaped the world before time began, did not speak of her. In that primordial symphony, where Iluvatar and his children sang into being all that would ever exist, there is no melody that clearly corresponds to Ungoliant, no harmony or discord that the wise can point to and say, "There, that is where she entered the pattern of Arda." This absence is itself deeply significant, for it suggests that she may have arisen from the discord introduced by Melkor, the mightiest of the Aenir, who sought to create his own melodies outside the theme of Iluvatar, who desired to bring into being things that existed for his glory alone, rather than as part of the greater harmony. Tolkien was meticulous in his world building, crafting elaborate genealogies that traced the lineage of his characters back through generations, creating etymologies that explained the origins of names and words in his invented languages, developing histories that accounted for every significant event in his imagined past. Yet for Ungoliant, he provided none of this careful documentation. Her origins remain shrouded, her parentage unknown, her very nature uncertain. This was not carelessness or oversight. Tolkien was far too deliberate a craftsman for that. Rather, it was a conscious choice, a decision to leave at the heart of his mythology a darkness that could not be fully illuminated, a mystery that could not be solved. The Silmarillion, that great compilation of the histories of the elder days, offers our primary account of Ungoliant. It tells us that in those ancient times, she dwelt in the southern regions of Ammon, the blessed continent where the Valar had made their home, far from the light of the trees in a dark ravine. There she lived on the fringes of the world, spinning webs of shadow between the branches of forgotten forests, growing ever larger and more terrible as she fed on whatever light she could reach. Starlight, the dim radiance of luminous fungi, even the faint glow that emanated from certain stones. But these were mere scraps compared to the feast she hungered for, the radiance of the two trees that illuminated Valinor with a light more beautiful than any that would ever grace the world again. Yet she could not approach the trees alone. They stood at the heart of the Valor's realm, in the very center of Valinor, on the green mound of Ezilohar just outside the golden gates of Valmir, the city of the gods. The Valor walked beneath those branches, and the Maiar served there, and the Vanyar, most blessed of the elves, dwelt nearby, basking in the eternal light. To assault the trees would require stealth and power beyond what even Ungoliant possessed, would demand a level of deception and force that could overcome the vigilance of the mightiest beings in all of creation. It would require an alliance with the only being whose malice and ambition matched her hunger, Melkor, who would later be named Morgoth, the black foe of the world, the first and greatest of all the Dark Lords who would ever threaten Middle-earth. The texts preserved in unfinished tales give us additional fragments. We learn that the elves sometimes called her Wirelame, which means the Weaver of Darkness. We discover that even among the Valor, there was disagreement about her nature. Some believed she had been a Maya who followed Melkor in his rebellion, and was transformed by her long dwelling in darkness and her corruption by his malice. Others suggested she might be something else entirely, a thing of the void, a manifestation of the emptiness that existed outside creation, somehow given form and hunger and terrible will. What we can say with certainty is that Ungoliant represents something fundamental in Tolkien's moral and metaphysical vision. The principle of privation, the idea that evil is not a creative force, but a destructive one, not a power that makes but only unmakes, that corrupts and consumes and reduces all it touches to nothingness. She is hunger without satisfaction, appetite without end, desire that grows stronger with every feeding rather than being sated. In this, she embodies one of Tolkien's deepest philosophical convictions, that evil ultimately desires the unmaking of all creation, the reduction of being to non-being, the transformation of the world into a void. A hunger older than the world itself stirs quietly in the forgotten corners of creation. This hunger did not arise from physical need or even from conscious desire in the way we understand it. Rather, it was ontological, a rejection of existence itself, a metaphysical rebellion against the very fact of being. And as the ages of darkness before the trees gave way to the illuminated beauty of Valinor, as the Valor shaped wonders and the elves awakened beneath the stars, this hunger grew, festering in the forgotten places, waiting for the moment when it might finally feed. The meeting between Ungoliant and Melkor was not a partnership of equals, but a convergence of mutual need, an alliance forged not from friendship or even respect, but from the cold calculation that each could use the other to achieve their desires. Melkor had been cast down from power before, overthrown by the combined might of the Valor when his discord and rebellion had grown too great to be ignored. He had been imprisoned in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages of the world, and when finally released, he had played the part of the penitent, bowing before Manwë and seeking forgiveness for his past crimes. But it was all deception, all cunning theater designed to lower the vigilance of his jailers so that he might plot his revenge. For Melkor had not repented. In his heart, he still nursed the same pride and malice that had led him to rebel against Iluvatar during the music of the Aenir, the same desire to rule and to corrupt, to claim all of Arda as his own domain and force all living things to acknowledge him as their lord. But he had learned caution. He had learned that open warfare against the Valar would only lead to his defeat. What he needed was a plan more subtle, a stroke that would cripple his enemies before they could marshal their strength against him. And what greater blow could he strike than to destroy the very source of light that illuminated Valinor, to plunge the blessed realm into darkness and steal for himself the treasures of the elves, the Silmarils, those 3 gems crafted by Feanor that captured within themselves the mingled light of the 2 trees. But even Melkor, mightiest of the Aenir, could not assault the trees alone. The Valar would perceive his approach and move to stop him. What he needed was an accomplice, something that could weave darkness so absolute that even the far-seeing eyes of Manwë could not penetrate it, something whose power was different from his own, not creative or destructive in the way of the Aenir, but negating, absorbing, consuming. He needed Ungoliant. The account of their meeting is one of the most vivid passages in the Silmarillion. Melkor came to her in secret, descending into the dark ravines of Avathar where she dwelt, treading paths that even the Valar did not watch. There, in the absolute blackness beneath the world, he found her, vast and terrible, shape-shifting and amorphous, sometimes appearing as a spider of monstrous size, sometimes as nothing more than a living shadow, a presence of hunger and malice that devoured the very air around it. He made her an offer. If she would aid him in his assault on Valinor, if she would weave the darkness he needed to approach the trees undetected, then he would give her everything her hunger desired. Light to devour, power to consume, and when his victory was complete, a feast beyond imagining. Not just the trees themselves, but all the jewels and lamps and radiant things that the Valar and elves had made in the long ages of peace. Ungoliant agreed, but not because she believed in Melkor's vision or wished to see him triumph. She aided him not out of allegiance, but to feed the void that dwelled in her heart. She cared nothing for his vengeance or his pride, nothing for his grand designs of domination and rule. She cared only for her hunger, and he was offering her the greatest feast that had ever existed in the world. She would have betrayed him in an instant if it served her appetite, would have devoured him as readily as she devoured the light he promised her. And indeed, that is precisely what she would attempt to do once their work was done. Together, they plotted the assault. Melkor knew the patterns of the Valar, knew the times when their vigilance was least, knew the paths that led to the green mound of Ezilohar. And Ungoliant could weave darkness like a cloak, could create a shroud of blackness so complete that it would hide them even from the eyes of those who could see across all the circles of the world. They waited for the hour of mingling, that sacred time when the light of both trees shone together at its fullest, when Tulpirian's silver was waning but still bright, and Laurelin's gold was waxing toward its peak. In that hour, the Valar and many of the elves gathered on the green slopes of Taniquetil, the highest mountain in Arda, to witness the blending of the lights and to celebrate the beauty of the world. And while they celebrated, Melkor and Ungoliant struck. The assault was swift and terrible beyond words. Melkor wielded a great spear of darkness, and with it, he smote the trees, piercing their mighty trunks, while Ungoliant reared up beside him, her countless eyes burning with hunger, and she set her beak to the wounds he had made and began to drink. She drank the light of the trees like wine, drawing it into herself in vast, gulping draughts that made her swell to enormous size. The silver and gold luminance poured into her maw, and rather than illuminating her from within, it was transformed into darkness, into a blackness more absolute than any natural shadow, into a negation of light itself. And as she drank, she vomited forth darkness, not merely the absence of light, but a positive substance of shadow, the unlight of Ungoliant, which no eyes could pierce, which stifled and smothered all radiance, which clung to everything it touched like a poisonous fog. This darkness spread across Valinor, rolling out in waves from the green mound, swallowing gardens and towers, streets and halls, until all the blessed realm lay in shadow and confusion. The Valar cried out in dismay and anger, but by the time they could gather and respond, Melkor and Ungoliant were already fleeing northward, racing toward the ice wastes where Melkor had long ago established his first great fortress. Behind them, the two trees stood broken and dying, their trunks pierced and their roots poisoned by Ungoliant's venom. The silver and gold light faded, dimmed, guttered like candles in the wind, and then went out entirely, leaving behind only twisted husks where once the greatest beauty in all of Arda had flourished. And yet, even after feeding on the light of the trees, even after consuming a radiance so pure and powerful that it had illuminated the blessed realm for ages beyond counting, her hunger remained unquenched, a darkness that no treasure could satisfy. This is perhaps the most terrible truth about Ungoliant, that she could not be satisfied, that there existed no feast sufficient to fill the void within her, that she was cursed to hunger eternally, growing larger and more desperate with each feeding, but never reaching satiation, never finding peace from the gnawing emptiness that consumed her from within. The flight across the ice wastes was a desperate race against pursuit. Behind them, the Valar were gathering, rallying from their shock and horror, preparing to unleash their power against those who had committed this unthinkable crime. But the darkness Ungoliant had vomited forth hampered even the gods themselves, confusing their sight, muffling their voices, making coordination and pursuit nearly impossible. By the time they could see clearly again, by the time they could determine which direction the thieves had taken, Melkor and Ungoliant had gained a lead that would prove insurmountable. They crossed the grinding ice of the Helcaraxe, that terrible northern strait where frozen mountains crashed together and immense floes ground against one another like the teeth of some vast beast. They traversed regions so cold that even Melkor, a being of fire and spirit, felt the chill seeping into his essence. And Ungoliant followed, grown now to a size beyond imagination, vast as a mountain, spinning webs that stretched across valleys, drawing after her a darkness so complete that stars went out where it passed. But Melkor's victory was not as complete as he had hoped. When he had broken the trees, when the moment of chaos had been at its height, he had raced to the dwelling of Fëanor, greatest craftsman of all the elves, and there he had found what he sought. The Silmarils, those three incomparable jewels that held within them the captured light of the trees, that shone with a radiance so pure and beautiful that they were accounted the greatest works of hand or mind that any had made outside of Valinor. He had seized them and fled, and now they burned in his iron crown, causing him pain with their holy light even as he gloried in their possession. And Ungoliant desired them. As they reached the northern regions of Middle-earth, as they came at last to the ruins of Angband, Melkor's ancient fortress, Ungoliant demanded her reward. She had done what Melkor had asked. She had woven the darkness that made their approach possible. She had drunk the light of the trees and vomited forth the unlight that covered their escape. Now she wanted her payment, all that Melkor had promised her, all the treasures he had hoarded in his vaults, all the radiant things he had stolen over the ages. Melkor gave her much. From his fortress, his servants brought forth jewels and golden things, lamps and crystals, all the shining works of elven and dwarven craft that he had seized in his wars. And Ungoliant devoured them all, consuming each treasure, absorbing its light and transforming it into darkness, growing ever larger, ever more terrible. But she was not satisfied. She demanded more. And when Melkor had given her all else, when his vaults were emptied of everything save one final treasure, she demanded the Silmarils themselves. And this Melkor would not give. These jewels he had seized at terrible cost, had murdered for, had broken the piece of Valinor to possess. They were the symbol of his victory, the proof of his power, and more than that, they contained the only remaining light of the two trees, the only remnant of that radiance that would ever exist in the world. To surrender them would be to lose everything he had won, to render meaningless all the destruction he had wrought. He refused, and Ungoliant attacked. The battle that followed is recounted only briefly in the Silmarillion, but the implications are staggering. Ungoliant, swollen to a size beyond comprehension by all that she had devoured, wrapped Melkor in her webs, ensnaring him in darkness, drawing tight the strands that would suffocate and crush even the mightiest of the Aenir. Melkor, for all his power, for all his might and malice, could not break free. He was caught, held fast by a hunger more absolute than his own will to dominate, by a darkness more fundamental than his own desire for power. Even the Dark Lord could not escape the insatiable hunger that trailed behind her like a storm. He cried out in terror and rage, his voice shaking the mountains, and that cry was heard by his servants who dwelt still in the depths of Angband. The Balrogs, those demons of fire and shadow who had followed him in his rebellion and had been corrupted into forms of terror, came forth from the pits where they had long been hiding. They came with whips of flame and swords of fire, and they fell upon Ungoliant, driving her back, forcing her to release her prey. But even the Balrogs, even those terrible beings who would later be feared as among the greatest servants of darkness in all of Middle-earth, could not destroy her. They could only drive her away, force her to flee into the south, into the forgotten lands where she would dwell in the valleys and mountains, growing ever larger, ever hungrier, until finally, according to some accounts, her appetite turned inward and she devoured herself, consuming her own essence in a final desperate attempt to satisfy the void within. But that end, if end it was, lay far in the future. For now, Ungoliant fled, wounded and enraged, denied the ultimate feast she had been promised. And as she went, she spun webs and birthed offspring, spreading her darkness and her hunger across the lands, giving rise to a lineage of terror that would plague Middle-earth through all the ages that followed. The mountains of Erd Gorgoroth, the mountains of terror, marked the place where Ungoliant finally settled after her flight from the Balrogs. These peaks, which formed a jagged barrier between the lands of Doriath and Gondolin, became her domain, filled with her webs and her spawnings, a region where darkness gathered so thickly that even the bravest warriors feared to tread. The valleys between the peaks became known as Nan Dungortheb, the Valley of Dreadful Death, and those names alone were sufficient to deter most travelers from attempting passage through that cursed land. But Ungoliant's influence spread far beyond those mountains. She bred, spawning countless offspring that inherited her hunger and her malice, though not her full, terrible power. These children of Ungoliant spread across Middle-earth, establishing nests in dark forests and deep caverns, spinning webs to trap the unwary, feeding on whatever they could catch, beasts, men, even elves if they were foolish or desperate enough to venture into spider-haunted regions. Through the First Age, these creatures plagued the kingdoms of the elves. Beren and Luthien, on their legendary quest to steal a Silmaril from Melkor's crown, were forced to traverse Nan Dungortheb, and only Luthien's power preserved them from the horrors that dwelt there. The webs of Ungoliant's children were not merely physical traps, but bore some quality of their mother's darkness. They sapped strength and courage, filled the mind with dread and despair, made escape seem impossible even when threads might be broken by force. As the ages passed, as the First Age gave way to the Second and Third, Ungoliant's spawn continued to multiply and spread. In the great forest of Mirkwood, where the shadow of Dol Guldur fell heavy and dark, giant spiders made their nests, growing to enormous size in the corrupt atmosphere that Sauron's presence created. These were the spiders that Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves encountered on their quest to Erebor, creatures large enough to prey on men and dwarves, intelligent enough to speak, malevolent enough to take pleasure in the terror of their victims. But the greatest of all Ungoliant's descendants, the one who most clearly manifested her mother's terrible power and malice, was Shelob. In the Third Age, this massive spider made her lair in the pass of Cirith Ungol, the high mountain pass that led into Mordor from the west. There she dwelt in darkness, grown to monstrous size over thousands of years, feeding on orcs and men and any other creatures that attempted to use the pass. She was a thing of such ancient evil that even Sauron, the Dark Lord of the Third Age, treated her with a kind of respect, leaving her domain largely undisturbed, using her as an unofficial guardian of Mordor's western border. The chroniclers tell us that Shelob had lived in that place since before Sauron first came to Mordor, since before the Dark Tower was built, since before even Minas Ithil was established as an outpost of Gondor. She was ancient beyond reckoning, a relic of an earlier age of darkness, and she embodied her progenitor's qualities in distilled form: the insatiable hunger, the preference for darkness, the ability to weave webs that carried some quality of shadow beyond mere physical substance, and above all, the malice, the active, intelligent desire to cause suffering, to take pleasure in the pain and terror of victims. When Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee attempted to enter Mordor by that route, guided by the treacherous Gollum, they encountered Shelob at the height of her power. The description of that encounter in the Two Towers is one of Tolkien's most visceral passages, filled with horror and desperation. Shelob is described as a vast, bloated creature, the most terrible of all the spawn of Ungoliant, whose eyes clustered in her head and whose hide was so thick that no blade could pierce it. The darkness around her was not merely the absence of light, but something more, a presence that sapped courage and strength, that made resistance seem futile, that carried the echo of her ancient mother's hunger and malice. And though she vanished into shadow, her hunger remained, growing in every dark corner of Middle-earth. This is the legacy of Ungoliant, not merely the physical presence of her descendants, but the persistence of the principle she embodied: hunger that cannot be satisfied, darkness that actively works to extinguish light, malice that finds expression in countless forms across all the ages of the world. The spiders of Mirkwood, the terror in Nan Dungortheb, the ancient evil of Shelob. All these were manifestations of Ungoliant's enduring influence, proof that her assault on the two trees, though it occurred in a distant age when the world was young, had consequences that rippled forward through time, shaping events and creating terrors that would afflict generation after generation of Middle-earth's peoples. But Ungoliant's significance in Tolkien's mythology extends beyond her physical descendants and their geographical locations. She represents something fundamental in his moral and metaphysical vision, something that transcends narrative function and becomes symbolic, archetypal. To understand what Tolkien hid about Ungoliant, what truth lies at the heart of her mystery, we must examine not just what she did, but what she means. In Tolkien's cosmology, evil is fundamentally privative. That is, it does not exist as an independent creative force, but only as a corruption or negation of good. Melkor could not create new life. He could only corrupt and twist the life that Iluvatar had created, transforming elves into orcs, breeding monsters from natural beasts, perverting the good for his own purposes. Sauron could not forge genuinely new things. He could only imitate and corrupt, creating rings of power by mimicking and perverting the creative work of the elven smiths. Ungoliant represents this principle in its purest, most extreme form. She creates nothing. She builds nothing. She leaves behind no works of craft or mind. She only consumes, only destroys, only transforms being into non-being. And unlike Melkor or Sauron, who at least desired to rule, to dominate, to reshape the world according to their vision, however twisted, Ungoliant desired nothing except the negation of all desire itself, the void, the emptiness, the absolute absence that would result if everything that existed were consumed and unmade. In this sense, she is more terrible than any Dark Lord, more fundamentally evil than even Melkor at the height of his rebellion. For at least Melkor wanted something, had goals and purposes, could be understood, however imperfectly, as a will seeking its own ends. But Ungoliant will turned against itself, desire that sought only the extinction of all desire, hunger that could never be satisfied because satisfaction would mean the end of hunger, and she was hunger itself. She had no existence apart from it. A darkness older than memory watches still, beyond the veil of the world. This darkness is not personal in the way that Sauron's malice was personal, not directed and focused and purposeful. It is the impersonal, implacable darkness of entropy, of heat death, of the ultimate cold void that awaits all things if they are left to run their course without intervention from beyond. It is the darkness that whispers to every living thing that existence is futile, that struggle is meaningless, that light and beauty and joy are temporary aberrations in an eternal night. Tolkien, as a devout Catholic, believed firmly in the ultimate victory of good over evil, in the triumph of being over non-being, in the assurance that light was more fundamental than darkness. The story of Ungoliant seems to challenge that assurance, to present a darkness so absolute that even the gods themselves cannot fully comprehend or contain it. Yet her story also affirms the deeper truth, that such darkness, however terrible, cannot ultimately create or sustain itself, can only consume until there is nothing left to consume, and then must turn inward upon itself in a final self-negating act. The elven lore masters whispered of Ungoliant with a fear different from the fear they held for Melkor or Sauron. Those dark lords could be fought, could be opposed with swords and strategies, could be understood, and therefore resisted. But Ungoliant represented something that could not be fully understood, could not be reasoned with, could barely even be perceived before it was too late. She was the existential dread that underlies all horror, the terror not of death itself, but of absolute extinction, of being unmade, of passing not into another mode of existence, but into utter non-existence. Even in Valinor, even among the Valar who had shaped the world and who commanded powers that mortals could barely imagine, there was unease when Ungoliant was discussed. Manwë, whose vision extended across all the circles of the world, admitted that his sight failed when he tried to perceive her fully. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, whose domain encompassed all seas and rivers, and whose knowledge of events across Middle-earth was exceeded by none save Manwë himself, confessed that there were movements in the deepest places, hungers in the abyssal dark, that troubled even his ancient spirit. Some among the wise suggested that Ungoliant might have been a manifestation of the outer dark itself, the void that existed beyond the circles of the world, the nothingness that Iluvatar had pushed back in order to create space for Arda. If so, then her hunger was not merely psychological or moral, but ontological. The universe itself seeking to return to the state of non-being that preceded creation, the void attempting to reclaim what had been taken from it. The scholarly debates about Ungoliant's nature extend beyond the fictional world into the real-world community of Tolkien scholars and enthusiasts. These discussions reveal how deeply the professor embedded philosophical and theological themes into what might superficially appear to be merely an exciting adventure story. Every shadow in the deepest woods whispers of a hunger that has never been sated, and every discussion among Tolkien's readers circles back to fundamental questions about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the ultimate fate of creation. Christopher Tolkien, in his editorial notes to the Silmarillion and his extensive commentaries in the History of Middle-earth series, documented his father's evolving thoughts on Ungoliant. Early drafts suggest J.R.R. Tolkien initially conceived of her as simply a very large and evil spider, a monster to provide a physical threat during Melkor's theft of the Silmarils. But as his mythology deepened and matured, as he grappled with the theological and philosophical implications of his created world, Ungoliant transformed into something far more significant, a symbol of privation, of the returning void, of evil in its purest and most absolute form. In some versions of the story, Tolkien wrote that Ungoliant came from the darkness that lies about Arda, suggesting she was not native to the world at all, but an intruder from outside creation. In others, he implied she might have been a Maya who had so completely corrupted herself through dwelling in darkness and feeding on light that she had transformed into something unrecognizable, a being whose very nature had been rewritten by her choices and actions. Both versions have profound implications for Tolkien's moral cosmology. If Ungoliant came from outside creation, then she represents the ultimate external threat, the void always pressing against the boundaries of existence, seeking to unmake what has been made. This reading aligns with certain theological traditions that see evil as fundamentally alien to creation, as an invading force that must be actively resisted and ultimately expelled. If instead she was originally a Maya who corrupted herself, then her story becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and obsession, about how even angelic beings can fall so far that they lose all resemblance to their original nature. This reading emphasizes personal responsibility and the reality of moral choice, suggesting that creatures become what they choose to be through their actions and desires. Tolkien never definitively resolved this question, and the ambiguity appears to have been intentional. By leaving Ungoliant's origins mysterious, he preserved her function as a symbol of ultimate unknowability, of the darkness that cannot be fully illuminated, of the questions that have no comfortable answers. She remains the horror at the edge of the map, the shadow that cannot be dispelled by any light, the hunger that reminds us that not all threats can be understood or overcome by courage and wisdom alone. Fan theories have multiplied over the decades, each attempting to fill the gap that Tolkien deliberately left. Some have suggested Ungoliant was the personification of Melkor's nihilism, a physical manifestation of his desire to unmake all creation. Others have proposed she was a fragment of the void given consciousness by the discord in the music of the Aenir. Still others have argued she represents entropy itself, the second law of thermodynamics given form and hunger, the inevitable tendency of all systems toward disorder and decay. Each theory has merit. Each illuminates some aspect of her function in the narrative and her significance in Tolkien's larger mythology. But none fully explains her, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the shocking truth that Tolkien hid about Ungoliant is precisely that there is no truth to be found, no comfortable explanation that would render her comprehensible and therefore less terrifying. Her full nature remains beyond our grasp, a shadow in the corners of history, whispering that some truths are too dark to name, that some aspects of evil are so fundamental and absolute that they exceed our capacity for understanding. The destruction of the two trees marked a turning point in the history of Arda, a catastrophe from which the world would never fully recover. Before that moment, light had been a permanent presence in Valinor, the trees illuminating the blessed realm with a radiance pure and constant. After Ungoliant's assault, that light was gone forever. The Valar wept, and Yavanna sang over the poisoned roots, calling on all her power to coax any last spark of life from the dying trees. And the trees answered. Tulperion produced a single silver flower, and Laurelin bore one golden fruit. These the Valar took and set them in vessels of crystal, and gave them to Maiar to bear through the heavens as the moon and sun. But the light of the moon and sun, while beautiful, was not the same as the light of the trees. It was diminished, secondary, a reflection rather than the original. The mingled radiance that had blessed Valinor in the elder days was lost, existing only in the three Silmarils, those jewels that Feanor had made and that Melkor had stolen. That would become the focus of so much strife and tragedy in the ages that followed. More profoundly, Ungoliant's assault had shattered the peace and security of Valinor itself. The Blessed Realm had been a haven, a place of safety where the Valar and elves dwelt without fear of violence or evil. Ungoliant had violated that safety, had proven that even in the uttermost west, even in the realm of the gods themselves, darkness could strike. The psychological impact was incalculable. If Valinor was not safe, then nowhere was safe. If the two trees could be destroyed, then nothing was permanent. If Ungoliant could assault the very source of light, then no light was secure. The consequences rippled outward across all of Arda. The elves, driven by grief and rage over the death of the trees and the theft of the Silmarils, swore terrible oaths, and launched a rebellion that would lead to the kinslaying at Ulqualinde, to the burning of ships, to the curse of Mandos that would hang over them through all the years of the First Age. Middle-earth, which had been relatively peaceful, became a battleground as the exiled elves warred against Melkor, seeking to reclaim what he had stolen. The great kingdoms of Beleriand rose and fell. Heroes lived and died in glory and tragedy, and all because Ungoliant's hunger had prompted Melkor to make his assault, had given him the means to destroy the trees and steal the Silmarils. Every shadow in the deepest woods whispers of a hunger that has never been sated. Even after the First Age ended, even after Melkor was finally overthrown and cast into the void beyond the walls of the world, even after the Silmarils were lost, and the broken lands of Beleriand sank beneath the sea, Ungoliant's influence persisted. Her spawn continued to breed and multiply. Her darkness continued to linger in forgotten places. The principle she embodied, hunger without end, consumption without satisfaction, the void seeking to reclaim all that exists, remained a threat that would manifest in different forms through all the ages of the world. In the Second Age, when Sauron rose to power and forged the One Ring, when he sought to dominate all the peoples of Middle-earth through the power of that ring, he was following in the footsteps of his old master Melkor, repeating patterns established in the ancient past. And those patterns had been shaped, at least in part, by Ungoliant, by the alliance with her that had made Melkor's greatest crime possible, by the hunger she represented that had driven him to extremes he might not otherwise have reached. In the Third Age, when Frodo carried the ring toward Mount Doom, when he had to pass through Shelob's lair to enter Mordor, he was confronting Ungoliant's legacy directly. The horror he felt in that dark tunnel, the paralyzing dread that nearly overwhelmed him, was not merely fear of a large spider but existential terror in the face of something that embodied absolute negation, that sought not merely to kill but to unmake, to reduce him to nothing. Sam Gamgee, when he faced Shelob after she had poisoned Frodo, wielded more than just a sword and the light of Eärendil's star. He wielded courage in the face of annihilation, hope against hopelessness, the stubborn insistence of mortal flesh and blood that being is better than non-being, that life and love matter even in the face of ancient darkness that would consume all things. His victory over Shelob was not merely physical but metaphysical. It was the triumph of the small and humble over the vast and terrible, the affirmation of existence against the void. As we approach the conclusion of this exploration, we must confront the question that has underlain our entire journey. What did Tolkien actually hide about Ungoliant? What is the shocking truth promised in our title? The answer is both simpler and more profound than any specific plot revelation or forgotten detail from the manuscripts. The truth Tolkien hid about Ungoliant is that she cannot be fully known. The shocking revelation is that there is no shocking revelation, or rather, that the absence of revelation is itself the point. By deliberately leaving her origins mysterious, her nature ambiguous, her ultimate fate uncertain, Tolkien created a darkness that resists illumination, a horror that cannot be domesticated by explanation. This was a conscious artistic choice, and a remarkably sophisticated one. In our age of comprehensive wikis and detailed encyclopedias, where every fictional universe tends to be mapped out in exhaustive detail, where fans expect and demand complete information about every character and event, Tolkien's decision to leave Ungoliant mysterious stands out as a bold rejection of false certainty. He understood that true horror comes not from what we know, but from what we cannot know, not from understanding, but from the failure of understanding. Consider how this approach differs from his treatment of other villains. Melkor's origins are clear. He was the mightiest of the Aenir who rebelled through pride and desire for power. Sauron's history is documented. He was a Maya who served Melkor, who survived his master's overthrow, who rose to power in the Second Age. Even the Balrogs are explained. They were Maiar corrupted by Melkor, transformed into demons of fire and shadow. We know where these beings came from, what motivated them, how they fit into the larger cosmology. But Ungoliant, she remains liminal, boundary-dwelling, impossible to categorize with certainty. Was she Maya or something else? Did she come from within creation or from the void outside? Was she born or did she simply emerge? The texts hint at multiple possibilities but confirm none. And this uncertainty makes her infinitely more terrifying than any fully explained monster could be. There's a theological dimension to this as well. In Christian tradition, which deeply informed Tolkien's work, evil is understood as privation, the absence or corruption of good rather than an independently existing thing. But how do you personify an absence? How do you give narrative form to negation? Ungoliant is Tolkien's answer to these questions. She is hunger without the thing hungered for. She is desire that seeks the extinction of all desire. She is being that seeks non-being, a paradox made flesh or shadow, or whatever substance she was composed of. By refusing to explain her fully, Tolkien preserved this paradoxical quality. Any definitive explanation would have resolved the paradox, would have transformed her from a symbol of ultimate unknowability into just another powerful monster with a comprehensible backstory. The mystery is not a flaw in the storytelling, but its greatest strength. Her full nature remains beyond our grasp, a shadow in the corners of history, whispering that some truths are too dark to name. This is not an admission of defeat, but a recognition of reality. There are aspects of existence, especially the darkest aspects, that exceed our capacity for full comprehension. We can describe their effects, we can narrate their actions, we can study their impacts, but we cannot fully grasp their essence because they are, at their core, opposition to essence, rejection of comprehensibility, negation of meaning. Ungoliant represents the limit of rational understanding, the point at which analysis must give way to awe and terror. She is the reminder that for all our wisdom and knowledge, for all our courage and power, there remains a darkness at the edge of things that we cannot domesticate, cannot fully understand, cannot entirely conquer. We can drive it back, we can resist it, we can choose being over non-being in our own lives and actions. But we cannot eliminate it entirely, and we cannot strip away all its mystery. This is perhaps the most profound truth in all of Tolkien's mythology, that the victory of good over evil is not a victory of complete understanding over mystery, not a triumph of light that eliminates all shadow and reveals all secrets. Rather, it is a victory of choice, of moral courage that persists even in the face of ultimate mystery, of hope that endures despite the knowledge that some questions have no comfortable answers. Perhaps she waits still in the forgotten shadows, hungering for the light that once belonged to the trees of Valinor, and whose hunger no age can satisfy. This ending is not meant to comfort, but to challenge, not to provide closure, but to open questions. In some versions of the legendarium, Ungoliant is said to have ultimately devoured herself, consuming her own substance in a final desperate attempt to sate a hunger that could never be sated. In others, her fate is left entirely unrecorded. She simply vanishes from the narrative, disappearing into the southern wastes, her final end unknown. Which version is true? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself misses the point. Ungoliant as a physical entity may have died or disappeared, but Ungoliant as a principle, as a symbol, as a manifestation of the hunger that seeks to unmake all things, that Ungoliant cannot die because she represents something eternal, something woven into the very fabric of existence itself. Every age has its darkness. Every era faces its own manifestation of the void pressing against the boundaries of creation. In the elder days, that darkness took the form of a vast spider that devoured the light of the two trees. In later ages, it took other forms: the shadow of Dol Guldur, the malice of Sauron, the despair that crept into the hearts of those who believed the struggle against evil was futile. And in our own world, outside the boundaries of Tolkien's fiction, we recognize the same essential darkness in different guises. The entropy that will eventually claim all stars, the abyss that stares back when we look too long into questions of ultimate meaning, the hunger for oblivion that whispers to troubled souls in their darkest hours. Tolkien understood this. He had walked through the trenches of the Somme, had watched friends die in the mud, had known personally the darkness that can overwhelm human existence. He had also found reasons to continue hoping, to continue creating, to continue affirming that being was better than non-being despite all evidence to the contrary. His work does not offer easy answers or comfortable certainties. It offers instead the harder, truer wisdom that courage and hope matter precisely because darkness is real, precisely because the void is always pressing at the edges, precisely because the struggle is never finally over. Ungoliant, then, is not merely a monster from an ancient fantasy tale. She is the personification of a truth we would often prefer to ignore. That creation is not safe, that light is always contested, that the struggle against darkness requires constant vigilance and courage. The shocking truth Tolkien hid is that there is no ultimate hiding from this reality, no final victory that would allow us to rest secure in the knowledge that evil is forever vanquished. But, and this is crucial, neither is darkness, victory, inevitable. The two trees were destroyed, but the sun and moon rose in their place. The Silmarils were lost, but their light survived, one in the heavens as a star, one in the depths of the earth, one in the depths of the sea. Ungoliant's spawn plagued Middle-earth, but they were repeatedly defeated by heroes like Beren and Luthien, by humble gardeners like Sam Gamgee, by anyone who chose to strike a light in the darkness rather than surrender to it. This is the final truth about Ungoliant, that she is terrible, powerful, ancient, and ultimately insufficient. For all her hunger, for all her power to consume and corrupt, she could not unmake creation. She could damage it, could scar it, could plunge it into darkness for a time. But she could not return it to the void. Being, once called into existence by Iluvatar's creative word, proved more stubborn than non-being. Light, once kindled, could be rekindled even after being extinguished. Hope, once planted in the hearts of the children of Iluvatar, elves and men, could survive even the deepest darkness. So let Ungoliant wait in the shadows. Let her hunger continue unabated. Let her symbolize all that we fear about the void, about entropy, about the darkness that seems to threaten all we love and value. She is real as the darkness in our own world and our own hearts. But she is not victorious. She is not sufficient. She is not final. Against her hunger, we set our own affirmation. That being is better than non-being. That light is worth kindling even in darkness. That beauty and joy matter even if they are temporary. That courage and hope are not delusions, but responses to reality deeper than the void. This is the wisdom of Tolkien's mythology, encoded in every story, embodied in every hero, reflected in the very structure of his created world. And this is why we return to these tales, generation after generation, finding in them not escape from reality but deeper engagement with it, not false comfort but true courage, not answers to all our questions but strength to continue asking them. The tale of Ungoliant, properly understood, does not end with her triumph or even her defeat. It ends with our choice to kindle light or surrender to darkness, to affirm being or accept the void, to hope despite all reason or to despair because of it. The shadow was born of starlight, and to starlight it must answer. The hunger arose from the void, and to the void it will ultimately return. But we, the readers, the listeners, the heirs of Tolkien's imagination, we dwell between shadow and light, between void and being, between despair and hope. And in that in-between space, in that contested ground where darkness and light meet, we make our choices and shape our futures. Perhaps she waits still. But so do we, armed with memory and courage, with wisdom and hope, ready to kindle whatever lights we can in whatever darkness we face, knowing that the struggle continues, that the story is not over, that every age must face its Ungoliant and every heart must choose its response. This is the shocking truth. This is what Tolkien hid in plain sight, that the darkness is real and terrible, but so is the light, and the choice between them matters more than any power of angels or demons, gods or monsters. Choose wisely, choose courageously, choose light. The tale is told, the darkness is revealed. And in the revealing, we find not despair but defiance, not an ending but a call to continue the ancient struggle, to add our own small lights to the constellation of stars that shine against the void, to honor the memory of the two trees by creating whatever beauty we can in whatever time we are given. Let Ungoliant hunger. Let her webs stretch across ages. We will meet her with fire and starlight, with courage and stubborn hope, and we will remember that darkness, however ancient, however powerful, however terrible, is not the final word. Being is the final word. Light is the final word. And that word was spoken at the beginning of all things, and it echoes still, and it will echo forever, no matter what shadows rise to challenge it. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.